Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time it is while you're watching this. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this paper, and thank you also to Luke Young for not only setting up but also persevering with the organisation of this symposium. My paper is concerned with a large part of the thesis is concerned, which is the intersection of autobiographical and scientific writing in the mid to late 17th century. This paper comes from a chapter which challenges a dominant narrative, which states that the early modern experimentalist or scientific essay was epitomised by Robert Boyle, Robert Boyle being the most celebrated member of the early Royal Society for Improving Natural Knowledge. This narrative then goes on to either fail to name any inheritors of Boyle's experimentalist essay style, or alternatively to state that the scientific journal, The Philosophical Transactions, which was set up by the Society's secretary, was the inheritor of this style. So the chapter in my thesis from which this paper comes looks at members of the Society who published essays in the 2 decades or so immediately following Boyle, and it argues that they should be considered experimentalist in genre if not in content. I view essaying itself to be an experimental process for these authors. In literary terms, the development of the essay from Montaigne throughout Europe from the 16th to 18th centuries is well trod, but discussions of the essay's utilisation by natural philosophers is usually curtailed at mention of Bacon or Robert Boyle as his imitator. Rather, it is sometimes assumed that two distinct essay forms emerged in England: the personal essay, typified by those of Sir William Cornwallis, and the moral, political, and empirical or scientific essay of Bacon and Boyle. Yet these two seemingly distinct forms can be seen to commingle in the essays of three figures: the poet Abraham Cowley, the economist and physician William Petty, and the rector and propagandist Joseph Glanville. They were all members of the Society, and they were the only ones following Boyle to have published collections of essays. Many commentators situate the early modern essay as a subgenre of autobiography, and they argue that the essay as a generic concept is the reflection on subjective experiences. I don't disagree with this. Rather, I would say that it is precisely this interplay of the autobiographical and the instructive, instigated by Bacon and Boyle, which these defenders of the recently set up Royal Society and its practices were to find so attractive. So at first, I'm just going to take a brief overview of some of the more common formal features of the early modern essay. The essay was concise, shorter in length than the dialogue or the treatise, which made it suitable for communicating singular concepts without prematurely binding them together into systems. Quotations from other sources were not always used simply as sources of authority, but they were deployed as contradictory evidence. Here, the inheritance from the Renaissance practice of commonplacing can be seen. Quotations from different sources were accumulated under headings, often with observations made by the collector. Now, when this technique is published by way of an essay, the reader must trust in the author as adjudicator, especially when it concerns works that they may themselves have not have read. The early modern essay on the whole, it was tentative, unfinished, and exploratory. It lacked assertiveness and required no conclusion. And it is precisely this lack of bombast which promoted the essayist as a figure to be trusted. Now, I argue that the rhetorical, generic, and formal qualities of the early modern essay were analogous to both the scientific writing of the early Royal Society and the natural philosophical method employed by its authors. The essay, being a speculative, hesitant, self-conscious genre, with its narrative being dictated by the lived experience of its author, was used as a tool to illustrate the process of discovery. However, the difference between the essay and the experimental reports of the Philosophical Transactions, that journal, lay in the essay's self-conscious projection of the values and identity of its author. The instability of the Society's incipient reputation was one reason which caused its defenders to write, and the essay was used by seemingly unlicensed propaganda for both the Society and the essayists themselves. So a reflective essay helps its author to interpret their experiences actually as they write. The essay, I would argue, is the autobiography of a reader, a thinker, and a reflector. And this becomes a tool of epistemological reform when the essay's reader is presented with the data for themselves. The essay, when read, is an advertisement for the cogitating individual. And I would like to argue that the essay form was adopted by the virtuosi of these members of the society and their defenders because of its association with personal knowledge and experience. So to begin with, of the three figures I want to discuss, I will start with Abraham Cowley for reasons of timeline. He was the first to write essays and the first to pass away. Abraham Cowley was one of, if not the most celebrated poets in England at the time of his death in 1667, and he was as famed for his abilities in composing in Latin as well as in English. He had also engaged with the work of the Royal Society. He wrote an ode to be published in Thomas Sprat's propagandist history of the Society, and he had also written a pamphlet on educational reform which echoed many of the Society's purposes. He had been a member, albeit an inactive one, since 1661, which is the year after its formation. Towards the end of his life, Cowley wrote a series of 11 essays. They were published posthumously in 1668 as part of a volume of work edited by that same Thomas Sprat. And these essays were, according to Sprat, intended as, quote, a real character of his own thoughts upon the point of his retirement. Now, this apparent retirement consisted of obtaining the lease on some of the Queen Mother's lands in Surrey and settling into the role of gentleman farmer in Chertsey in 1665. Now, this was a decision that he was criticised for. Why would a brilliant man of the court and general society turn from public life? The key question for my purposes is, why did Cowley turn to prose? And specifically, why did he turn to the essay form? So, to answer this, I'll consider again some of the main aspects of the emergent English essay tradition. It was often used as a tool of persuasion and reform. It allowed the author to create a space for themselves outside of institutional structures. And it was also a genre in which the autobiographical is an essential means of communicating one's lived experience. Now, considering all this, Cowley's purpose becomes clearer. His method is like Bacon's, like that of the natural philosophers, even if the subject matter is not scientific itself. Cowley advocates for a life of useful practice away from city life, and he argues for his personal retreat and agricultural life, arguing that this is the best engagement he can have with the natural world. The essay's emphasis is on a modest life, a curtailment of ambition, and of using one's time productively. And in particular, they are an inducement to useful enterprise, a record of Cowley's discovery for what, for him contributes the most useful enterprise. There is an overwhelming theme of liberty, and this theme of liberty extends not simply to the court, but from all corrupting, unthinking, traditional institutions. We might recall that the Royal Society and its methods were intended as a refreshing break from the dogmatic Aristotelianism of the traditional universities. Cowley isn't explicit about the Royal Society's essays, but the method is the same. Emphasis is placed most heavily on the moral individual experiencing the natural world for himself, away from corrupting institutions. So what we have here is an example of the essay being used in defence of personal actions, and these are actions which Cowley aligns with the purpose of the Royal Society. So Joseph Glanville, moving on, is understood to be one of the most enthusiastic supporters of and apologists for the early Royal Society. He'd attacked the contemporary Aristotelians in his Vanity of Dogmatizing in 1661 and his Scepsis Scientifica in 1665. This work was coupled with a lengthy address to the Society, which earned him membership. He then published his major work of propaganda in defence of the new science, Plus Ultra, in 1668. Glanville's most significant work from these volumes was collected together in his Essays upon Several Important Subjects in Philosophy and Religion, 1676, and this was dedicated to his patron rather than the Society. Only the last of the 7 essays in this work was entirely original, and this was a form of utopian fiction. The others were all reworkings of earlier works. The question of why Glanville chose to publish a collection of essays has not, I believe, been addressed. And the change doesn't really make a lot of sense if Glanville's role of author of propagandist treatises is viewed as successful. The answer is that Glanville had become something of a menace for the society. His treatises had been as much attacks on individual critics as promotion of the new science. These feuds had started to boil over to the point where Glanville and his subjects were paying men to sing rather rude songs in alehouses about each other, and this was obviously becoming a public relations disaster for the Royal Society. By 1669, members of the society were complaining to each other that no man is more odious over all this country than Mr. G, no man more suspected for moralities. Now, Glanville turned to the essay, a more personal form of writing, after these feuds threatened to negatively affect the reputation of society. Yet, as previously mentioned, there is very little which characterises these 7 essays as essayistic, in the same vein as the works of Bacon, Cowley, or Petty, who I'll be discussing shortly. Each of the pieces is of considerable length, is boldly assertive. They chronicle improvements in natural knowledge and also argue for the existence of witches with equal bombast. And this was becoming a controversial topic. The final and only original essay is, as I've remarked, a piece of utopian fiction and no essay at all. Very little was edited in the preparation of Glanville's works for this publication, aside from removing some of the slightly ruder comments he directed to some of his critics. Glanville, therefore, simply yokes the term of essays to his collection. He presents them as, according to the preface, a fertile and useful production written over the course of a life. If the content and structure of Glanville's essays mark them as an abbreviated collection of hits, rather than the speculative, seemingly unfinished trials of the cogitating author, their organisation demonstrates that Glanville understood the mechanics and purpose of an essay collection in recommending its author to a reading public. So what's interesting here is that Glanville appears to have taken a leaf out of Cowley's book. Glanville alludes to his privacy and retirement in the preface to his essays, and he uses this as an excuse for example, not having kept up with his reading. This retirement does seem to be fictitious. He was still rector of Bath at the point of writing, and he would become prebendary of Worcester 2 years later. But the impression given is one of withdrawal, both from public disputes and the Royal Society itself, and the essay collection is presented as the workings of a lone individual. This does seem to have worked, by the way. Glanville was no longer discussed angrily in private letters between society members, and his essay collection largely escaped comment, negative or otherwise. Now, if Glanville's reputation among the virtuosi never truly recovered, that of the statistician William Petty never publicly diminished during his lifetime. His literary output was relatively slight, and it is therefore of some significance that Petty was the 3rd and final Royal Society Fellow to publish works under the title of essay in the 30 or so years following Boyle's first use of the term. The 3 published essay works, dating from the latter years of Petty's life, may at first appear to be superficially bereft of autobiographical impulse. But if we examine Petty's wider habits of manuscript circulation, we can illuminate these slim texts and provide justification for his selection of the title of essay, as opposed to any other. So Petty was eager for patronage, and from 1686 he began to inundate the new monarch, King James II, with proposals which he refers to as essays. These orally delivered essays contributed greatly to his advancement in the king's favour. He wrote in July of 1686 that I am just now going to Windsor to get an essay read to the king, that London hath more people and houses than Paris and Rouen put together. His exhibition of such brief papers worked in his favour. By September of the same year, Petty and the king were engaged in private correspondences. Petty's concern was not with print publication, but with ensuring that his manuscripts reached the correct audience, one that would recognise his talents and afford him some kind of privilege for them. Petty's circulated manuscripts were designed to be read aloud and digested there and then once they had arrived at the correct ear, and they can be viewed as so many assays or trials going abroad until they manage to achieve patronage. The primary function of these papers, Petty's essays, was to impress upon an audience a sense of Petty's abilities within minutes. Although they contain few directly autobiographical elements, the ultimate message to be circulated was a sense of Petty's intellect, and the very manner of their circulation demonstrates determination, even in the latter years of his life, to advance his fortunes. For Petty, the power of the essay lay both in its association with the true character of the author and its snapshot of knowledge at a particular moment, knowledge and growth. The truth of the essay was both personal and provisional. It was a useful way for Petty to attract patronage, with the promise of yet more essays to come. The concept of reciprocal characterization applies here. Whatever the object, the art of observation elicits an aspect of the subject which may be termed good or honest character, that the observation be taken to be true. With Petty, as with Glanville and as with Cowley, it is that demonstration of honest character which lies behind their selection of the essay genre. So just to conclude, I argue that the essay form's close association with personal experience made it uniquely suited to boosting not only the reputation of the Royal Society's members, but also of its members, a function seen in these writers, which was a development from earlier 17th century uses of the form, but not a direct ancestor of the Philosophical Transactions Journal, as is so often taken to be the case. Thank you.